The summer heat pressed down on London like a heavy blanket as thousands of tourists crowded around Buckingham Palace. Among them stood Marcus Thompson, a decorated United States Marine on his first vacation in 10 years. His short cropped hair and straight posture gave him away even in civilian clothes. Marcus had fought in 3 tours overseas, earning respect from fellow soldiers and commanding officers alike. Now at 28, he was finally taking the break his sister had begged him to take for months. Marcus pushed through the crowd, his camera hanging loosely around his neck. He had promised his mother he would take pictures of everything, especially the famous guards everyone talked about back home. The red uniforms and tall black hats looked almost comical to him, like something from a children's book. He had heard stories about these guards, how they never moved or spoke while on duty, but Marcus found it hard to believe. In his experience, real soldiers were always alert, always ready to respond to threats. As he approached the palace gates, Marcus noticed one guard standing perfectly still at his post. The man appeared to be in his mid-20s, with sharp features barely visible under the shadow of his bearskin hat. His name was James Wellington, though Marcus would never learn this. James had been serving in the Queen's Guard for 3 years, following a family tradition that stretched back 4 generations. His great-grandfather had stood at these same gates during World War II, and James carried that legacy with pride. Marcus stopped about 10 feet away from James, studying him with the critical eye of a professional soldier. The British Guards uniform was immaculate, every button polished to perfection. His rifle was held at exactly the right angle, and his breathing was so controlled it was barely noticeable. Marcus had to admit the man looked professional, but he wondered how long that discipline would last under pressure. The American pulled out his phone and took a few pictures, like any other tourist. But unlike the others, Marcus didn't move on after a few minutes. Something about the guard's perfect stillness bothered him. It seemed too easy, too comfortable. Marcus remembered his own training, the hours spent learning to maintain position under extreme conditions. He wondered if this British soldier had ever faced real challenges, or if this was just ceremony and show. James, meanwhile, had noticed the American almost immediately. Years of training had taught him to observe everything while appearing to see nothing. The man's posture, the way he carried himself, the calculating look in his eyes. Everything screamed military. James had dealt with soldiers from other countries before. Some were respectful, others were curious, and a few were challenging. This one felt different, more intense. The crowd around them continued to move and chatter, but neither man paid attention to the tourists. Marcus found himself genuinely impressed by the guard's control, but his competitive nature began to stir. Back home, Marines prided themselves on being the toughest, most disciplined fighting force in the world. He wondered how this ceremonial soldier would measure up against real military training. Marcus decided to test the waters. He moved closer, positioning himself directly in the guard's line of sight. Most people would have looked away or shown some reaction, but James remained perfectly still. His eyes stared straight ahead, never wavering, never blinking more than necessary. The American felt a flicker of respect, followed immediately by the urge to push harder. The afternoon sun climbed higher, and Marcus noticed sweat beginning to form on other tourists' faces. He looked for any sign of discomfort from the guard, but saw none. James's training had prepared him for London's unpredictable weather, from freezing winter mornings to sweltering summer days. He had learned to ignore physical discomfort, to focus his mind on duty above all else. What started as casual curiosity was transforming into something more serious. Marcus realized he was witnessing the kind of discipline he rarely saw, even among his fellow Marines. This wasn't just about standing still. It was about complete mental control, the ability to shut out distractions and maintain focus for hours at a time. The competitive spirit that had driven Marcus through military training began to awaken. As the minutes passed, other tourists came and went, taking their pictures and moving on to the next attraction. But Marcus remained, and James continued his perfect stillness. Neither man knew it yet, but they were about to engage in a contest that would test everything they had learned about discipline, endurance, and military pride. The silent duel was beginning, and both soldiers were ready for whatever came next. 20 minutes had passed, and Marcus was still standing in the same spot. The tourists around him had changed completely. Families with children had been replaced by elderly couples, who were now giving way to young backpackers. But the American Marine hadn't moved an inch, and neither had James. What had started as casual observation was becoming something entirely different. Marcus felt his competitive nature taking over completely. He had always been the type of person who couldn't back down from a challenge, whether spoken or unspoken. During his military training, instructors had used this trait to push him beyond his limits. Now, facing this perfectly disciplined British guard, Marcus felt that same fire burning inside him. He wasn't just watching anymore. He was participating in an unspoken contest of wills. James, despite his training to ignore distractions, was becoming increasingly aware of the American's presence. In 3 years of guard duty, he had never encountered someone who stayed in one position for so long. Most tourists took their photos and left within minutes. Even military personnel from other countries rarely lingered more than 10 or 15 minutes. But this man was different. James could sense the challenge in the air, thick as London fog. The British Guard's training kicked into high gear. He had been taught that any break in concentration, any acknowledgement of distraction was a failure of duty. His commanding officers had drilled into him that the Queen's Guard represented centuries of British military tradition. Every moment he stood at his post, he carried the honor of every soldier who had stood there before him. This unknown challenge would not break that chain. Marcus began to feel the physical demands of maintaining his position. Standing perfectly still was harder than most people realized. His legs were starting to ache, and he had to resist the urge to shift his weight from one foot to the other. He thought about his Marine training, the hours spent in formation under the blazing sun at Paris Island. Those memories strengthened his resolve. If he could survive Marine Corps boot camp, he could outlast one British ceremonial guard. The summer heat was intensifying, and both men were beginning to sweat inside their clothes. James's wool uniform was designed for British weather, not the unusually warm day London was experiencing. But years of training had taught him to ignore physical discomfort. He focused his mind on a single point straight ahead, using meditation techniques his sergeant had taught him during his first year of service. Marcus noticed other guards changing shifts around the palace grounds, but James remained at his post. The American realized this guard might be committed to a longer duty period than he had initially thought. This made the challenge more interesting. Marcus had nowhere else to be. His vacation schedule was completely flexible. He could stand here all day if necessary. A group of American tourists passed by and noticed Marcus standing so still for so long. One of them jokingly asked if he was part of the display. Marcus didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge the comment. He was fully committed now to whatever contest was developing between him and the British Guard. The joke from his fellow Americans only reinforced his determination to prove that American military discipline was second to none. James heard the comment and felt a flicker of understanding. So the American was military after all. This explained everything: the posture, the intensity, the refusal to back down. James had always wondered how soldiers from other countries would measure up against the Queen's Guard. Now he was getting his answer, and he was determined not to disappoint his regiment. The clock tower in the distance chimed the hour, marking 45 minutes since Marcus had first stopped in front of James's post. Neither man had moved, spoken, or shown any sign of giving up. The unspoken rules of their contest were becoming clear. No movement, no acknowledgement, no surrender. It was a pure test of discipline and willpower. Palace security officers had begun to notice the unusual situation. They were trained to spot potential threats, and a man standing motionless for nearly an hour definitely qualified as unusual behavior. But Marcus's posture and demeanor didn't suggest any hostile intent. If anything, he looked like he was showing respect for the guard's duty. Still, they decided to keep an eye on the situation. Marcus felt his respect for the British Guard growing with each passing minute. Whatever else could be said about ceremonial duties, this level of discipline was genuinely impressive. The man hadn't blinked excessively, hadn't shifted position, hadn't shown any sign that he was aware of being watched so intently. Marcus had to admit that this kind of mental control was exactly what he would expect from an elite soldier. The contest was no longer about testing the guard's limits. It had become a matter of mutual respect and professional pride. Both men understood they were representing more than themselves. Marcus carried the reputation of the United States Marine Corps. while James bore the honor of the British Army and centuries of royal tradition. Neither was willing to be the first to break. An hour and 15 minutes had passed when the first real test came. A group of rowdy teenagers approached the palace gates, clearly looking for entertainment. They had heard about the guards who never moved and wanted to see for themselves. What they found was even better. Not just an immobile guard, but also a tourist who seemed to be playing statue as well. The teenagers started with simple tactics, making faces and funny gestures in front of both men. When that got no response, they became bolder. One of them started telling jokes loudly. Another began singing off-key pop songs. A third teenager pulled out his phone and started playing videos at full volume. The noise was intentionally annoying, designed to break concentration and get a reaction. Marcus felt his jaw muscles tighten, but he didn't move. During his military service, he had endured far worse attempts at breaking his focus. Drill sergeants had screamed in his face. Fellow Marines had tried every trick imaginable during training exercises. A few teenagers with phones and bad singing voices weren't going to crack his resolve. He kept his eyes fixed straight ahead, maintaining the same position he had held for over an hour. James faced the same challenge with equal determination. Royal Guard training included specific preparation for dealing with disruptive tourists. He had been taught to treat such behavior as enemy psychological warfare, using the same mental techniques soldiers used in combat situations. The teenager's antics were just another test of his professional discipline, no different from rain, snow, or blazing heat. The situation escalated when one particularly bold teenager decided to see how close he could get to the guard without triggering a response. Palace security immediately stepped in, firmly but politely moving the group away from the gates. The intervention lasted only a few minutes, but it served as a reminder that both Marcus and James were operating under public scrutiny. After the teenagers were moved along, an interesting thing happened. Several adult tourists who had witnessed the scene began to understand what was taking place. Word started spreading quietly through the crowd that something special was happening. An American soldier was having a silent contest with the British Guard. People began pointing and whispering, some taking photos of both men. Marcus became aware of the growing attention but refused to let it affect his concentration. He had learned during military service that external pressure could either strengthen or weaken a soldier's resolve, depending on how they chose to handle it. He decided to use the attention as motivation, representing not just himself but all American military personnel who might hear about this later. James felt the weight of observation even more keenly. As a Queen's Guard, he was always on display, but this felt different. Usually tourists looked at him as a curiosity, a living statue or museum piece. Now they were watching him as a competitor, evaluating his performance against a worthy opponent. The pressure was intense, but it also filled him with pride. This was what he had trained for, the chance to prove the excellence of British military tradition. The afternoon heat reached its peak, and both men were dealing with serious physical discomfort. Sweat was running down their faces. Their feet were aching from standing motionless for so long, and their muscles were beginning to cramp. But neither showed any outward sign of distress. Years of military conditioning had taught them to push through physical barriers that would stop ordinary people. A palace tour guide noticed the situation and quietly explained to her group what was happening. She had worked at Buckingham Palace for 8 years and had never seen anything like it. Usually, when military personnel from other countries visited, they might salute the guards or take respectful photos, but this silent contest was unprecedented. She found herself genuinely curious about who would prove stronger. Marcus began using mental techniques he had learned during survival training. He imagined himself as an immovable mountain, rooted to the earth and unaffected by wind, weather, or time. He controlled his breathing, slowing his heart rate and conserving energy for what might be a very long contest. His military training had prepared him for extended periods of physical and mental stress. James employed similar techniques from his own training regimen. Royal Guards were taught to enter an almost meditative state during long duties, separating their consciousness from physical discomfort while maintaining complete alertness. He pictured himself as part of the palace itself, as permanent and unchanging as the stones in the wall behind him. The crowd around them continued to grow as word spread through social media. Someone had posted a video online with the caption, "American Marine versus British Royal Guard, epic staring contest at Buckingham Palace." The post was gaining traction, with comments pouring in from military personnel around the world, each side cheering for their representative. Both men remained unaware of their growing internet fame, focused entirely on the contest between them. What had started as a simple test of discipline was becoming a symbol of military pride and international rivalry. The silent duel was no longer just between Marcus and James. It had become a representation of two military traditions testing themselves against each other on the world stage. 2 hours into their silent confrontation, both men were entering uncharted territory. Marcus had never maintained a single position for this long outside of emergency survival situations. His legs felt like concrete pillars, heavy and unresponsive, but his Marine training had taught him to push beyond the point where his body wanted to quit. He focused on his breathing, using techniques learned during meditation exercises that were part of his stress management training. James was facing his own physical battle. Royal Guard duty typically involved movement between positions, ceremonial marching, and regular shift changes. Standing completely motionless for 2 hours straight was testing limits he had never explored before. His wool uniform, designed for British weather, was becoming a furnace in the unusual summer heat. But surrender was not in his vocabulary. It never had been. The crowd around Buckingham Palace had evolved throughout the afternoon. Morning tourists had been replaced by lunch-hour office workers, who were now giving way to afternoon sightseers. But the story of the American Marine and the British Guard had spread through social media, drawing people specifically to witness this unexpected contest. Some spectators had been there for over an hour themselves, becoming invested in the outcome. Palace security was monitoring the situation closely, but had decided not to intervene. Both men were clearly military personnel showing mutual respect through their contest. No laws were being broken. No disruption was being caused beyond the natural curiosity of onlookers. If anything, the situation was demonstrating the highest ideals of military, discipline, and international cooperation. Marcus started experiencing moments where his vision would blur slightly from the strain of maintaining focus for so long. He had learned during survival training that the human body would try to force rest through micro-sleeps and momentary lapses in consciousness. Fighting these natural responses required constant mental vigilance. He began counting his heartbeats, using the rhythm to anchor his mind and prevent any unconscious relaxation. James was battling similar physiological challenges. His training had included instruction on managing extended periods of motionlessness, but theory and practice were vastly different. He could feel his blood circulation slowing in his legs, creating a tingling sensation that threatened to become cramping. Royal Guard instructors had taught him to redirect his attention during such moments, focusing on duty rather than discomfort. A group of off-duty British soldiers happened to pass by the palace during their afternoon break. When they saw what was happening, they immediately understood the significance of the contest. Word quickly spread to their barracks, and soon several military personnel were discreetly observing from the crowd. They felt a sense of pride watching their fellow soldier represent British military excellence against international competition. Meanwhile, an American military attaché working at the nearby embassy heard about the situation through social media posts. He made his way to the palace, curious to see which American service member was making headlines. When he arrived and saw Marcus in his civilian clothes, maintaining perfect military bearing, he felt a surge of national pride. This unknown Marine was representing American military values on foreign soil with honor and distinction. The afternoon sun began its descent, but the temperature remained uncomfortably high. Both men were now dealing with serious dehydration, though neither would admit it even to themselves. Marcus had water in his backpack, but reaching for it would mean breaking position and conceding defeat. James had no access to water at all during his duty period, making his situation even more challenging. A British news reporter who happened to be covering a separate story at the palace noticed the growing crowd and investigated. When she learned what was happening, she realized this was a much better story than her original assignment. She began interviewing spectators, gathering quotes about the impressive display of military discipline they were witnessing. The story was about to gain national attention. Marcus found his mind wandering to memories of his toughest training exercises. He remembered a particular survival course where he had gone without food or water for 36 hours while completing navigation challenges. The memory reminded him that he had survived worse conditions than standing in London heat for a few hours. His body might be screaming for relief, but his spirit was still strong. James drew strength from thinking about his grandfather, who had served in the same regiment during World War II. Stories passed down through his family told of soldiers who had maintained their posts under enemy fire, who had chosen duty over comfort in life-threatening situations. This contest, while intense, was nothing compared to what previous generations of guards had endured. The video posted earlier was now going viral, with thousands of views and hundreds of comments from military personnel around the world. Veterans from both countries were debating the outcome, sharing their own stories of endurance and discipline. What had started as a personal contest between two soldiers was becoming an international symbol of military dedication and mutual respect. Neither Marcus nor James was aware of their growing fame, but both could sense the weight of expectation from the crowd around them. They were no longer just two individuals testing their limits. They had become representatives of their respective military traditions, carrying the hopes and pride of everyone who had ever worn their uniforms. 3 hours had passed, and the contest had evolved into something neither man had anticipated. What began as a test of discipline had become a meditation on the limits of human endurance and willpower. Marcus felt as though he had entered an altered state of consciousness, where time moved differently and physical discomfort became a distant concern. His Marine training had taught him that the mind could overcome the body's protests, but he had never experienced it so completely before. James was experiencing his own transformation. The rigid discipline of Royal Guard training had prepared him for this moment in ways he was only now beginning to understand. Every hour spent in formation, every drill practiced until it became instinct, had been building toward this test of ultimate military bearing. He felt connected to every guard who had ever stood at these gates, drawing strength from their collective example. The crowd had grown significantly as news of the contest spread through London. Office workers were stopping on their way home, tourists were changing their schedules to witness the spectacle, and local residents were bringing chairs and settling in for what might be a very long evening. Someone had started taking bets on who would last longer, though most spectators seemed more interested in the display of mutual respect than in declaring a winner. A senior British Army officer happened to pass by and immediately recognized the significance of what he was seeing. He quietly positioned himself where he could observe both men, noting their perfect military bearing despite obvious physical strain. In 30 years of military service, he had rarely seen such a pure demonstration of soldier discipline. He found himself hoping that both men would somehow find a way to end the contest with honor intact. Marcus was drawing on every mental technique he had ever learned. He visualized roots growing from his feet into the ground, anchoring him in place. He imagined his body as a statue, immune to fatigue and discomfort. Most importantly, he thought about every Marine who had ever faced impossible odds and refused to quit. Their legacy was flowing through him, giving him strength he didn't know he possessed. The British Guard was employing equally sophisticated mental strategies. James pictured himself as part of an unbroken chain stretching back centuries, connecting him to every soldier who had ever defended the crown. He drew inspiration from stories of guards who had maintained their posts during the London Blitz, who had stood their ground while bombs fell around them. This contest was his opportunity to prove worthy of that tradition. As evening approached, the temperature finally began to drop, providing some relief from the oppressive heat. But both men were now facing new challenges. Muscle fatigue was setting in seriously, and the longer they stood motionless, the more difficult it became to maintain circulation in their legs. Marcus could feel his calf muscles beginning to cramp, but he had experienced worse during desert training exercises. James was battling similar physical symptoms while also dealing with the weight of his ceremonial rifle and the thick wool of his uniform. Royal Guards were trained to maintain their positions regardless of weather conditions, but 3 hours of complete motionlessness was pushing the boundaries of that training. Still, the thought of disappointing his regiment was more painful than any physical discomfort. The social media attention had exploded beyond anything anyone could have predicted. Videos from multiple angles were being shared across platforms, with military personnel from dozens of countries weighing in with comments and encouragement. The hashtag #TruckMarineVsGuard was trending internationally, and news outlets were beginning to pick up the story. The contest had become a global phenomenon. A group of American tourists recognized Marcus from one of the viral videos and realized they were witnessing internet history in the making. They began quietly cheering for their fellow American, though they were careful not to be disruptive. Similarly, British onlookers were showing quiet support for James, creating an atmosphere of friendly international rivalry that both men could sense even in their focused states. Marcus found himself thinking about why he had joined the Marines in the first place. It wasn't for glory or recognition. It was for the chance to be part of something larger than himself, to uphold standards that few people could meet. Standing here in London, representing American military excellence on foreign soil, felt like the culmination of everything he had worked toward during his military career. James was experiencing similar reflections about his service to the Crown. Being a Royal Guard wasn't just a job, it was a calling that connected him to British history and tradition in the most direct way possible. Every tourist who took his picture was capturing a piece of that history, and this American soldier was helping him demonstrate its continued relevance in the modern world. The contest was no longer about winning or losing. Both men understood that they were participating in something special, a display of military values that transcended national boundaries. They were showing the world what dedication, discipline, and mutual respect looked like when pushed to their absolute limits. The silent duel had become a symbol of everything noble about military service. 4 hours into their epic standoff, both men had transcended normal human limitations and entered a realm of pure willpower. Marcus felt disconnected from his physical body, as if he were observing himself from outside. His Marine training had prepared him for extreme situations, but nothing quite like this sustained test of motionless endurance. Every fiber of his being wanted to shift position, to relieve the burning sensation in his legs, but his commitment to the contest had become absolute. James was experiencing a similar state of detached focus. Royal Guard training emphasized the ability to separate mind from body during long duties, but he had never applied these techniques for such an extended period. His consciousness seemed to float above the physical discomfort, anchored only by his unwavering dedication to duty and the growing respect he felt for his American challenger. The crowd around Buckingham Palace had grown to hundreds of people, with many having traveled specifically to witness the contest after seeing it on social media. News crews from multiple countries had arrived, setting up cameras at respectful distances. The story was being broadcast live around the world, with military bases and veteran organizations hosting viewing parties to cheer for their representatives. A senior American general who happened to be visiting London heard about the situation and made his way to the palace. When he saw Marcus standing in perfect military bearing after 4 hours, he felt a profound sense of pride in American military training. This unknown Marine was demonstrating the highest ideals of military service to an international audience, and doing so with honor that reflected well on the entire corps. Palace officials were monitoring the situation carefully, consulting with military advisors about how long this could safely continue. Both men were clearly pushing the boundaries of human endurance, but they were also displaying exactly the kind of discipline and dedication that military service was meant to instill. No one wanted to interfere with such a remarkable demonstration of professional excellence. Marcus was now operating on mental reserves he didn't know he possessed. His legs had gone numb below the knees and he could feel his heart rate slowing as his body tried to conserve energy. But his mind remained crystal clear, focused on a single objective, maintaining position no matter what happened. He thought about every Marine who had ever faced impossible odds and chosen to stand their ground. James was drawing on 4 generations of family military tradition for strength. His great-grandfather's stories of standing guard during air raids in World War II seemed to speak to him across the decades, reminding him that Royal Guards had always been expected to maintain their posts regardless of circumstances. This contest was his opportunity to prove himself worthy of that legacy. The late afternoon sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the palace grounds. The changing light created a dramatic backdrop for the 2 figures who had remained motionless for so long that they had become part of the landscape itself. Photographers were capturing images that would become iconic representations of military dedication and international friendship. British military psychiatrist who specialized in stress and endurance, was quietly observing from the crowd. She had never seen such a sustained display of mental discipline outside of laboratory conditions. Both men were clearly operating at the extreme limits of human psychological endurance, yet they showed no signs of breaking. It was a remarkable demonstration of what proper military training could achieve. Marcus felt time becoming elastic, stretching and compressing in ways that defied normal perception. Minutes felt like hours, but somehow the entire afternoon also seemed to have passed in an instant. He was existing in a space between consciousness and meditation, aware of everything around him yet completely focused on the single task of remaining motionless. James was experiencing similar temporal distortions. The training that had taught him to stand guard for hours at a time had prepared him for this, but not completely. He was discovering reserves of mental strength he hadn't known existed, accessing levels of discipline that went beyond anything he had practiced during training exercises. The international attention was now massive, with hashtags trending in multiple languages and military personnel from around the world expressing amazement at the display they were witnessing. Veterans organizations were using the contest as an example of military excellence, and recruitment offices were reporting increased interest from young people inspired by the demonstration of dedication they were seeing. Social media comments were pouring in from active duty soldiers, veterans, and military families, all expressing admiration for both men. The contest had become a symbol of everything positive about military service: discipline, dedication, mutual respect, and the ability to push beyond normal human limitations in service of higher ideals. As the fourth hour ended and the fifth began, both Marcus and James understood that they were no longer just individual soldiers testing their limits. They had become living symbols of military excellence, representing the best traditions of their respective services to a global audience. The weight of that responsibility was both humbling and empowering, giving them strength to continue when their bodies had nothing left to give. As the fifth hour approached its end, something extraordinary happened that no one had anticipated. The setting sun created a moment of perfect symmetry, casting both men in identical golden light that seemed to honor their incredible achievement. The crowd had grown silent, recognizing that they were witnessing something that transcended competition and had become pure art. Two warriors at the absolute peak of human discipline and dedication. Marcus felt a profound shift in his consciousness. The physical pain had moved beyond discomfort into a realm where it became almost irrelevant. His body was sending signals that he acknowledged but chose to override through sheer force of will. He was operating on something deeper than training now, a fundamental understanding of what it meant to be a soldier, to commit completely to a mission regardless of personal cost. James was experiencing his own transformation. 5 hours of motionless standing had pushed him beyond every limit he had ever imagined, yet he felt more connected to his purpose as a royal guard than ever before. He wasn't just standing at his post anymore. He was embodying centuries of British military tradition, proving that the values his ancestors had died for were still alive and strong in the modern world. The crowd sensed that something significant was about to happen. The energy around the palace gates had changed from excited curiosity to respectful awe. People were witnessing human endurance at its absolute peak, and many felt privileged to be present for such a remarkable demonstration of military excellence. Cameras continued recording, but the atmosphere had become almost sacred. Palace security and military officials had been in quiet consultation for the past hour, concerned about the welfare of both men, but reluctant to interrupt such an extraordinary display of discipline. Medical personnel were on standby, but both soldiers showed no signs of distress beyond the obvious physical strain that anyone would experience after 5 hours of motionless standing. Marcus suddenly felt a moment of perfect clarity that cut through the fog of endurance and determination. He realized that this contest had achieved something more important than victory or defeat. It had created a bridge of mutual respect between two military traditions. The British Guard had proven himself to be every bit as dedicated and disciplined as any Marine Marcus had ever served with. The competition had become collaboration. James experienced a similar revelation at almost the same moment. This American soldier had demonstrated the kind of unwavering commitment that James associated with the finest traditions of British military service. The contest had evolved beyond national rivalry into a celebration of the universal values that made military service noble: duty, honor, and the willingness to push beyond normal human limitations. What happened next surprised everyone, including the two participants. Almost simultaneously, both men made the slightest of movements, not breaking position, but shifting into identical stances that military observers recognized as mutual salutes of respect. It was so subtle that civilian onlookers might have missed it, but every veteran in the crowd understood its significance immediately. Marcus felt a smile trying to form despite his exhaustion. This British soldier had earned his complete respect through 5 hours of perfect discipline under international scrutiny. The contest no longer needed a winner. Both men had already proven everything that needed proving about their respective military traditions. The demonstration of mutual respect was worth more than any declaration of victory. James felt a similar sense of completion and satisfaction. The American had shown himself to be a worthy representative of his service, displaying exactly the kind of dedication and mental toughness that James associated with elite soldiers. The contest had become a conversation between professionals, conducted entirely through action rather than words. The crowd erupted in applause as they realized what had just happened. Both men had found a way to end the contest with honor intact, demonstrating not only individual excellence, but also the kind of mutual respect that should exist between military professionals from allied nations. The applause continued for several minutes, with many spectators wiping away tears at the emotional conclusion. News outlets around the world carried the story as an example of military excellence and international cooperation. The 5-hour silent duel became legendary in military circles, with both the Marine Corps and the British Army using it as an example of the highest standards of military bearing and discipline. Neither Marcus Thompson nor James Wellington became household names, but their achievement became part of military folklore. In the days that followed, both men received commendations from their respective services. Marcus returned to his unit with a deeper understanding of what it meant to represent American military values on the world stage. James continued his service with the Queen's Guard, carrying with him the memory of a contest that had pushed him beyond every limit he thought he had. The viral videos of their contest continued circulating for months, inspiring countless young people to consider military service and reminding veterans why they had been proud to wear their uniforms. The silent duel at Buckingham Palace had become more than a contest. It was a testament to the enduring power of military discipline, mutual respect, and the human capacity to transcend normal limitations in service of higher ideals. Years later, both men would look back on that afternoon in London as one of the defining moments of their military careers.